So with that, I think, let's see here, we're a few minutes after the hour. So I want to introduce myself. I am Diane Blazek. I'm the Executive Director for National Garden Bureau and All America Selections. I have with me Gail Pabst. She is there managing everything behind the scenes. She's the reason you knew about this webinar because she handles all of our marketing. And what I want to do is go through our panelists and then let each of them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about their company. And then we are going to start in with our seed starting tips. So we have as our panelist, BJ Miller from Happy Leaf LED Lighting. We have Jonalyn Burt from Johnny Selected Seeds. And we have Ashley Smith from TrueLeaf Market. So BJ, why don't you introduce yourself and your company?
Okay. I'm BJ Miller. I'm a horticulturalist for going on 25 years now, and I've run the gamut. Almost all of the various aspects in horticulture that I've worked involved seed starting or propagating in some fashion. I used to actually maintain and design an All-American Selections garden when I was at Kishwaukee College, and won some accolades there, but I love seed starting. It's one of my favorite aspects of horticulture, and I can't wait to share information for you.
Great, thank you. Okay, Jonalyn. Oh, wait a minute. So you said you used to at Kishwaukee. So you've had experience starting seeds in Illinois, and where are you located now?
Yeah, so myself and Happy Leaf are out in Oregon, Illinois. I'm a consultant for Happy Leaf, so we go to trade shows and do educational seminars, teaching people how to do all manner of growing indoors with horticultural lighting. And yeah, so it's cold here. Seed starting is a big part of our gardening life here in Illinois. I know we have people from all over, but
yeah, exactly.
Definitely changes things.
Great, thank you. Okay, Jonalyn, and I'm assuming you're in Maine.
I am in Maine. Yeah, I work for Johnny Seeds, and we're a seed company. We're selling across the US and some international as well, which is great. We're kind of, I think, maybe best known for our trialing program. So anything that ends up in our catalog is something that we've looked at across multiple trials, maybe multiple seasons. So we know that stuff really well. And that lends to our expertise in any crop, and that's the information that we can share with you all on our website. So that's another really great resource. We also do some of our own breeding. So if anybody knows Carmen Pepper, that was one that I really loved before I started working here.
And it's a winner, yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
And I'm a trial technician there. So I run trials for my crop list, which the list is long, but namely alliums, not garlic. Anything you start from seed, that's an allium. Beans, peas, watermelon, sweet corn, and a bunch of other things, but the list is long enough. So that's me.
That would be very helpful. Good, thank you. Okay, and Ashley, you've got to explain your mountains in the background.
Yes, so I work with TrueLeaf Market. We're also a seed company. We're based out of Salt Lake City, Utah. So you can see this is about what our weather has been looking like the past few weeks. Looks like we're going to have a few more weeks of it looking like this as well. But we started out with our seeds specializing more for like the Intermountain area where we experienced some cold winters and some warmer summers. But more recently, we've expanded to have a lot more organic seeds. We also specialize in sprouting and microgreen seeds. We sell all across the United States as well as internationally. But yeah, we are happy to be here and share our knowledge of seed starting. And hopefully we can help you guys understand a little bit more about, the ins and outs of it.
I'm absolutely positive you will. So I thought that one of the first questions that I would ask of our panelists is, what's the most common question you get about seed starting? It's going to be interesting to see if anybody has the same question. So tell you what, Ashley, you're on screen. So why don't you go first and we'll go the reverse order. And what's the question you get most frequently about seed starting?
We usually get asked just what should be started indoors? Like what's the difference between what can you just sow directly outside and not have to worry about it versus what do you have to really be careful with?
Okay, that's good. Jonalyn, what about you?
Our most common question is, why didn't my seeds germinate? And that is not a reflection of the quality of our seeds by any means. It's, I think, reflective of the way that people will come to us for advice when something maybe goes a little bit wrong, and maybe why everyone's on the seed starting webinar.
Yes, this is true. Very good point. Okay, BJ.
Well, I probably get two because I do work with grow lights and teach people about how to better grow using grow lights. I most commonly get, how many hours did the grow lights get on? How high above my plant should those lights hang? When do I start lighting the plants? So that's probably my most common, but I also manage a greenhouse, and there the most common question is, how come I can't get my seeds to germinate, like Jonalyn said, or I've got them to germinate and then they fail. And then you have to run down the gamut of that particular grower and what it is that you kind of have to troubleshoot with them to kind of figure out their individual problem.
Okay, great. Well, luckily, thankfully, we did have those questions on the list that we were going to go through today. But if there's anything that we don't get to, make sure that we, circle back to make sure that we provide those answers. And we definitely are already getting some questions. Continue to put the questions in the chat. We will insert those into our list of questions as we're going through. But I wanted to start first with an explanation, and you guys just jump in, whoever wants to answer this. Direct sow versus indoor sowing and then transplanting. So let's just talk about, how do you make a choice? How do you know which ones to do which way?
Actually, that's your number one asked question. You must have a great answer.
Yeah, so I think basically it all comes down to getting to know your seed. It's important to understand just the category that it falls under. So, with us, we handle a lot of people who are usually growing vegetable seeds. And with that, you tend to have, your warm season seeds and then your cool season seeds. Cool season seeds can usually be started indoors or directly sown because they can handle the cooler soil temperatures. They usually don't have a problem if you sow them in the spring. Versus your summer seeds, more like corn, tomatoes, peppers. Those ones, they really want the warmer soil temperatures, and you're not really able to get that when you sow them early in the spring. And so it's more important to start those ahead of time. It also allows people who live in shorter growing seasons to be able to add a few extra weeks on of growing indoors so that they can enjoy a longer harvest throughout the summer season. As far as flowers, again, it really comes down to understanding, what the individual needs of the seed are and what its typical growth habit is. Is it something that grows up high in the mountains and is more of a wildflower? And again, it's naturally going to be in that cool spring temperature category. Then yeah, go ahead, sow those outdoors. But if it's something that really needs to be kind of babied more, if it's more of like a cut flower production kind of a thing, those are things that you're going to want to, investigate a little bit more.
Okay, Jonalyn or BJ, you want to add anything to that before I go to my next question?
Yeah, I'll just say that there's an aspect of personality as to whether or not you personally want to, like Ashley said, sometimes they take some babying. So if you're starting them indoors, it does take a little bit more effort and a little bit more monitoring because you don't have occasional precipitation to help you out. So just think about that. And if you're really a go-getter and you want like the earliest bean you're ever going to get, then maybe you can try starting it indoors.
Trial and error, right? That's a lot of what gardening is. Yeah. So are there some that just don't do well transplanted? I know the answer, but I want to hear from you guys. Is that true, or is there a way to manipulate it so you really can? The one I'm thinking of is they say sunflowers don't like to be transplanted. Well, I've done it successfully. But what are especially beginning gardener tips or more experienced gardener tips? Which ones should you just not try to transplant?
I can jump in on that one. Some plants are just really sensitive to the disturbance of the root zone. And those are the ones that categorically fall into direct sow straight into the garden. There are a lot of plants like sunflowers. You hear that about sunflowers. You hear it about cucumbers. You hear it about corn, squash, melons. that they are best direct sowed into the garden. And that is true. They have some sensitivity. But if you're careful with them and you have an established root zone and you haven't let it get root bound, you can start many of those things indoors first and then transplant out. It does depend on your temperature. You never want to direct sow. You still want the atmosphere, the environment to be conducive to direct sowing. But if you wait till the last frost and the soil's consistently warm, you can get away with direct sow on a lot of things. But here in Northern Illinois, we tend to push the boundaries on what we start indoors because we need the extra time for our growing season.
Absolutely. I think my question was further down, but you mentioned warm soil. So, and I know it's going to be different for different crops, but can you give some general guidelines, like how warm should the soil be before transplanting something like tomatoes, peppers, melons, or even direct sowing a melon versus some of the like peas? I mean, right? Don't they? I think here in Chicago, they said plant peas around St. Patrick's Day or something. So let's talk about that. Some of the things you can plant in cooler soil and what exactly is cooler soil and what soil temperature denotes maybe warmer soil temperatures.
Well, for me, a good general rule is 70 degrees. Really between 68 and 72 is like, if you have several different things going and you got to pick, that would be my range. Luckily for us, most seeds do have a range that they can germinate very successfully at. Cool crops, which were mentioned before, like your broccoli, cabbage, lettuce seeds, parsley is a cool crop, snapdragons, pansies, the things that can tolerate the cold a little bit more. Those can be germinated at lower temperatures. In a wider range of temperatures, I would say. Luckily, indoors at most of our homes, we keep it around 70, some of us less, some of us more. So we kind of have that going for us already. There are some exceptions. To me, I think it's much harder to germinate heat-loving seeds and warm crops like peppers, eggplants, especially hot peppers. Those really benefit from bottom heat. And those heat mats usually keep them between 75 and 85 degrees. So that's quite a bit higher than most average homes. So I'd say temperature is crucial. If you're having trouble germinating, definitely be taking a look at temperature.
Okay, and somebody had just asked that, are heating pads necessary? So let's name some of the crops. You mentioned hot peppers and hot peppers specifically, eggplants, any others that you recommend the heating pad bottom heat for?
I'll say watermelon is one of my crops. Certainly enjoys a little bit of extra heat.
If you're unfamiliar with what a seed mat looks like, they're usually the size of a seed tray. And they tell you, I would definitely recommend getting one that has a thermostat on them, because I have troubleshooted these, and some of them, depending, quality is kind of everything with these. They can be fairly, they say they run 75 to 85 degrees, but I have troubleshooted that and they can run a little higher or a little lower. But you set your seed tray or whatever you're seeding on directly on there, and it keeps the soil temperature is what's really important. It has much less to do with air temperature than it does soil temperature. So that's the benefit of a heat mat. And there are crops that will benefit from that don't necessarily need it. But almost all of your crops will germinate faster on a heat mat.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about timing, which I know, oh my goodness, it's probably different for every single crop. It's different no matter where you're located. We're trying to cover it all on this webinar. So can you guys do your best to help us figure that out? And Jonalyn, I think I'm going to point to you because you guys have an excellent tool on your website that we talk about a lot.
Yep, I'm queuing it up and sending it in the chat right now.
Okay.
We've got a seed planting schedule calculator. So you enter in for your area, you can just Google what your last frost date is in the spring, and that'll help you determine how many weeks in advance you'll need to start your whatever you're starting indoors. And that's kind of going to be the same across different varieties within the same crop group. So you can definitely use that. It's quite helpful.
And that lists vegetables and flowers, correct? If I remember, or is it all
I
vegetables?
believe so.
Okay. Okay. Excellent. That's good. Anybody else have any tips then on trying to, I think my tip is don't start too soon or else you're going to have some overgrown plants or they're going to get leggy or something like that. So as hard as it is, I always want to I want to start planting like January and I'm like, okay, I know that that's too soon. So that to me is the biggest holdback that I have to do.
I think one of my biggest recommendations is just include it into your planning. Like make sure that you make your list of whatever it is that you're going to grow, and then document, if you're starting it ahead of time, and then how many weeks ahead it needs to start. And usually you can find that information either online on your seed product pages, or it'll be on the packets, or you can just find like a general range, with a quick Google search. But just planning that out will help you to, schedule it ahead of time. Then you can even add in when are you transplanting and when should you be able to harvest that crop.
Good point. And that makes me think the value of also keeping track, like keeping a journal year to year. I try to think back, oh, well, did I plant this before or after I took this trip, et cetera. Very, very helpful to keep a journal. What was successful? What did you start too early or too late? Things like that. So that's good. Somebody had asked me, I use the term leggy. I will use my definition and you guys correct me. So basically leggy usually means that it's probably not getting enough light and it grows too tall, too spindly, not strong enough. You guys have a better definition there for leggy?
That
Okay.
sums it up.
Spindly and leggy.
Yes. Okay. So now let's talk about the growing medium you use or you recommend to start seeds. How important is it to be very precise and have one type of growing medium or seed starting medium, or is there a little bit of leeway and flexibility in what you use?
Yeah, I think you have a little bit of leeway with it. The most important thing is just making sure that you have a good environment for roots to develop. You're looking for something that's going to be more light and fluffy and allow, to get those really nice white fuzzy roots going, and to keep them from, wrapping around and becoming root bound. I always like using either a mix or, something that will help it be substantial. I like using coconut coir, peat, and just so I like making my own mixture, but you can also use pre-made mixtures. Here at TrueLeaf Market, we offer an amended coconut coir. So if you're growing something for several weeks at a time, most seed starting mixes aren't big in nutrients, because it's going to be a shorter time. But if you are growing something for a longer time, you're going to want to keep in mind that you'll want to add nutrients to it or to start with something that's already amended.
Okay, any additions to that?
They will sell you a lot of a question I get because we do sell it at the greenhouse is, do I really need a soilless mix specific for seed starting? And the biggest difference between that and potting soil is particle size. Seed starting mixtures tend to have very fine particles, and that helps roots grow very easily through them and shoots, so that there's not a lot of resistance, so that they can take off much quicker. And that's the beauty of using a seed starting mix. But like Ashley said, there's little to no nutritional value in a seed starting mix. But I tend to use it, but I have a little, I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's really, really finely textured. There's no big chunks of bark in it. It's usually a combination of perlite, vermiculite, and peat.
Sorry, we couldn't see that. I don't know if you want to try it again. We saw your sleeve, but not your hand, not what was in your
I got
hand.
some weird lighting
There
going.
it is. Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Excellent. And you were talking about nutrients. So why don't we go ahead and talk about that? So when you're, first starting your seeds, how much water do you put in? Should there be any nutrients at that point? And if not, at what point should you start using some sort of fertilizer? How much? What should it be? That kind of question.
I kind of err personally on the side of being a tad reactionary with adding nutrients because oftentimes there is some nutrients built in, maybe not in a strict seed starting medium. But I think that what is more common is that people will over fertilize and burn their poor little seedlings because they don't need a whole lot. They are very small. So that's my caution there. If anyone wants to jump in.
Say reactionary, are you looking for signs in the leaf color? What are you looking for to make you react and then fertilize?
Sure. Leaf color, like you mentioned, if your plants are all kind of getting a little bit yellowed, they're maybe not as green and as lush as you'd like them to be, then you can think about adding something to maybe your water. Maybe it's a water soluble fertilizer, or honestly, maybe transplanting into a different medium, like more of a potting mix that has nutrients built in.
Somebody has a question about how should you tamp down? Should you pack down the seed starting mix, or do you want to leave it light and fluffy?
Please don't pack it.
Yeah.
I
I
vote
was
for
waiting for
do not pack
somebody to
it
say
down.
that. Yeah, right.
You really, it's essential that you have your seed in really good contact with the soil, but that does not mean packing it down in there. I see people do it all the time and they're pressing down on it. My little trick to help me avoid too much compaction, because compaction is going to slow germination because they're not going to be able to get those roots and shoots through the soil as quickly. But I usually moisten my soil first because when you water plants, you're compacting the soil a little bit. So make sure you're starting with that nice moist media in the first place. And then I might give it a gentle, just to keep any of the air pocket, the air pocket small around the seed. But generally when I fill my seed tray, I give it a little shake, let it settle a slight bit on its own. And then through misting and other watering practices, you're really compacting it all it needs to be without your help.
Excellent. Yes. Okay. We did have a question. I think this is on a specific, the seed starting mix with fertilizer by Miracle-Gro. Is it too harsh for some seeds, or is it okay? Do you have experience with that specific one? And if not, that's okay. If you don't have experience with that one. So no.
I will say, like Jonalyn said, yeah, seedlings, they're remarkable little nuggets of nature. They, in that seed, I mean, they have stored energy reserves to get them to germinate. So it's really after germination, you even start thinking about fertilizer.
Okay.
In a real sense, in a regimented sense. Yes.
Right. Okay. Going on to the next question is about, should you cover or should you not cover your seeds? There's probably different classes that you should or shouldn't. How do you know? Do you just read the seed packet? What if it doesn't have it on there?
I think a big misconception that we get a lot of times is that people think that they need to black out, their seed starts for the first however many days. But that's really not true. When you plant a seed naturally, it's going to be in a darker setting if it's covered with soil. Basically, the best use for a cover is just to help keep the moisture up, to keep it a little bit more humid in there so that you're not losing as much water just to the open air. Because your seed isn't really going to use a lot of water, at the first. It's just mainly, getting germinated and getting sprouted, that you just don't want to be losing to natural evaporation due to your regular room temperature.
Okay, so are there certain seeds that do require light to germinate?
There are, that's one that you're going to want to specifically get that information either from your packet or online. But I know just off the top of my head, like strawberries are a big one. There's a reason you don't want to bury those, and it's because they require the light. But there's also several other seeds, and it's not always super obvious. That's why you kind of want to get to know your seeds, as you're selecting them.
Exactly. Yeah. I think especially if you're beginning, that may not even be something you think of. You just think you have to cover all your seeds, but yet there are some that need light to germinate. So, and then what about seed planting depth? Any rules of thumb on that one?
Well, the light and the depth, I mean, they are very hand in hand topics. Generally, and I don't really see this in the literature, it's just through experience. It seems that the smaller the seed, the more chance it requires light to germinate, as a very general rule. But I have always heard and planted with great success that you bury the seed 2 to 3 times as deep as the seed is wide. And so very, very tiny seeds, obviously that's not very much. It's either exposed to the light or it's got a very light coating of media over the top of it. But going back to the food reserves that the seed already has, the smaller the seed, the less food reserves it has. So that's a big part of why some may be requiring light and some don't, because they need access to light quickly to start making their own energy.
Isn't nature amazing? I love it. So somebody had posted a comment about extension recommends vermiculite to cover seeds to the recommended depth. Agree, disagree? It depends.
I think there's certainly advantages to having vermiculite. If you have noticed that you have a lot of algae growing on top of your soil mixture, then it might be useful to add that. That will keep air in that mix a little bit better and maybe prevent some of that algae growing and frankly competing for nutrients and light there. I don't take a hard line on any soil amendment, so.
Okay. Then what about, we had kind of mentioned this, you talked about covering, but I was going to ask about covering with plastic or a dome. Ashley, I think you had mentioned keeping humidity in. So just overall comments, is it a really good idea to somewhat cover, I mean, not airtight, but somewhat cover your seeds during the germination process? And then at what time should you uncover?
I like to use a cover personally because knowing my own personality, I'm not watching my seeds every moment of every day. So it's less likely that they'll dry out when I happen to be doing something else. So it kind of gives you a little bit more wiggle room. And then as soon as you see anything, I would take that cover off and just make sure that you can see what's going on under there. I think that's the main thing, is that you have visibility with what's going on with your seedlings.
I think too, homeowners and commercial growers have access to different types of things for that part of the process. For a homeowner, I am 100% behind using a humidity dome. It takes so much guesswork out of it. I think the number one reason people kill their seeds and seedlings or don't get germination at all is moisture levels. They're too high, they're too low. Humidity domes, and I can show you a couple. I'll show you the Cadillac first. Like, this is what we're talking about when we say humidity dome. So you've got whatever you're growing in, but it has a top. And like Diane said, it's not like seal proof. You're not closing it off to the outside world and all the oxygen in the air. They have vents on top so you can still exchange. But your moist soil is going to keep a humidity level in here that is essential for a lot of plants, especially to speed up germination. It is important to remove it as soon as you get germination on your crops, though, because then you'll start having disease issues.
Exactly. Or if somebody like a certain someone did when she was first start growing, she started cucumbers inside and didn't pay attention to them for a couple of days. I came back and oops, I just admitted it was me, didn't I? And the seedlings were like this big and all curled around. So I'm like, okay, toss them out. I started them too early, right? I was in Chicago but anyway, we all have those mistakes that we learn from, right? I hope all of you can say you've made mistakes like I do. Okay, lots of questions about lighting. So we've germinated, they've sprouted, we've taken off the dome. Then what? How much light? How far? Should you put the lights up from these little seedlings? So let's talk about that.
Well, seeds need access to light as soon as they're germinated. I get asked because of the light aspect of what I do. When should I add my lights? You're saying that there's some seeds that need dark to germinate. Why would I set my lights up? I always set my lights up when I'm sowing, because Do you have to? No, because they're under the soil, they're not even germinated yet. They don't really need the light, but you have a relatively small window of opportunity to get that light to them once they emerge out of the soil. If you miss that window, you've missed a lot on quality of your plants. So I just set them up right away. If they're buried in the soil, not needing it, it's only going to be a couple days out, especially with really efficient LED lights. You know, it's not like you're using a lot of electricity that's unnecessary. And then we have the seeds that do require light. So for me, it's much easier to have consistent success if you just set the lights up at first. And at first, you really want to give them quite a bit of light intensity. So I always tell people 14 to 16 hours at first. You can start backing off that as they become established plants. But
yeah, I was going to ask about that, the number of hours. 14 hours, because I start mine in the basement, you know, so like 14 hours of light, that still leaves a long time where they're not getting light. And I just feel like mine get so leggy again. So is there a harm in keeping the light on 24 hours a day?
For most crops, no. There's a lot of crops that do need that resting phase, though. You don't want to be actively pushing them so strong that they're just trying to grow at too fast of a rate. You still want a nice, stocky, strong plant. So you don't want to push them so hard that that you're overlighting them. But really, I've grown a lot of things where I've left the light on 24 hours and it doesn't seem to inhibit them at all. And there can be some benefit to that. But 16 hours is quite a bit. 16 hours, at least where we live, is the longest you're ever going to see in a daylight lit by the sun. So
Excellent. Okay. So a lot of other questions here about lighting. So fluorescent versus LED. BJ, kind of thinking you might take that one. Is it really the energy savings? Is that the difference between the two, or are there other benefits?
There's a lot of benefits. I'm not just saying that because of Happy Leaf. I'm saying that as a home, someone who has started seeds in my home for years. And fluorescents were the only thing really available to us. That's all that, if you wanted to buy a grow light, fluorescence is what you got. When I met Happy Leaf, I met them because I was trialing their lights in a hydroponic situation. And I couldn't believe the incredible difference between what we had available to us and what was coming on. And it was the first time, you know, growers tend to really think through very well water and fertilizer and the right things, but lighting often got neglected and it really changed my life when it comes to seed starting, because under the right LED, because there's also some very low quality LEDs that aren't pushing out the spectrum that you need. It gives such a wider range of spectrum. And now seeds can be started under fluorescent lights. It's when they emerge and now you've got true leaves on them that the difference really comes in with a good quality full spectrum LED light, because they're putting off very little blue light and that's it, the fluorescence. So when you have a full spectrum LED, they're getting the red light and the green light and all the light that they use and use to develop when they're becoming plants. Because a lot of times people, and that's one of the problems people have, they get them to germinate, but now they're spindly, they're leggy, it's not just lack of light, because you might have your fluorescence right on there. It's the lack of quality light. I get the same question as south-facing window. I mean, for after all, it's the sun. Well, here where we're starting seeds in March, and we just got 4 inches of snow last night. At this time of year, we're only getting 8 hours of sunlight a day. That's still not enough. So you could have the brightest, greatest south-facing window, and it's still not, the day length isn't long enough. So to me, there's a big difference between fluorescents and LEDs. When I made that switch, at the time I had both. So I got the benefit of seeing that side-by-side trial, and the difference is incredible.
Okay. And then we also have a question about how far away should the lights be from the plants, and does it change as the plants grow?
I'm sorry, Jonalyn and Ashley, I can't stop myself from answering light questions. I won't talk about it. Yes, it does matter when you're seed starting like fluorescence. You want to keep those pretty close, 2 to 4 inches off your plants, which can be a problem for certain crops because they also put off heat and you can burn and scorch your seedlings. LEDs don't burn hot like that. It's not a bulb at all. It's a diode. So instead of 2 to 4, you can hang it 12 to 16 inches above your plants and still get the intensity and all of the light that the plants need. So they can be hung much higher. And one side benefit of that is the higher you can hang your light above your plants is the more coverage you get. So when you're having to put your lights so close to your plants, you need a lot more if you're going to grow a lot of seeds versus LEDs that you can hang a little higher. You get much better coverage on those. But yes, it does change as your plants grow. In the case of LEDs and specifically Happy Leaf, you want to start 12 to 16 because seedlings don't need intense light. But as they grow older, tomatoes and really light loving plants, you want to kind of keep it 6 to 10 inches away from your crop.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Well, this isn't a light question, BJ, so you don't.
Okay. I'm all back.
We'll let Jonalyn and Ashley jump in here now. What about air circulation? Should you have a fan near your seedlings? What is the importance of good air circulation around your seedlings?
Yeah, so having fan circulating air, it mostly helps you prevent some diseases that can happen just, without air moving. That's when you can get growth of unwanted things like algae, and being able to circulate the air will just help to, keep them healthier in the long run, really.
Okay, so it's a healthiness issue. It's not really going to help with the legginess. The legginess is all about the light. Then the circulation is more about the overall plant health. Is that a good summary?
There is an aspect to legginess that some people might be thinking of where they are likely to just flop over, and that can be helped by having air circulation. So if you have a fan directly on your little seedlings that normally they wouldn't be experiencing, if you're starting them indoors, they wouldn't be experiencing that sort of the breezes that you would get outside. And if you do have air movement, they're kind of wiggling around a little bit. It stimulates the cells to become more rigid and be able to support the plant better. So if you were to take this tender little tomato that hasn't had a breeze in its whole life and you put it outside, the wind might just flatten that thing. So you got to be a little bit careful. Maybe, I know my mom would just run her hands over her plants a couple times a day. It's kind of nice, then you get to pet your plants too.
That's always a good thing, right? Yeah. Okay, they're very, very good. We really didn't, there's a lot of questions coming in about the lights. BJ, I think you're gonna have to share your email because we're happy. Yeah, a lot of questions about the LED lights. So we'll try to get to them later, but as we go through some of these other basics. Questions about some seeds need stratification, scarification. Can you guys talk about that? How to do it, which seeds might need it?
I will just say that it's rare in the seeds that I'm starting that I need to give them any special attention.
Okay, and you're mainly talking about vegetables, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm thinking maybe that's more applicable to perennial seeds or native seeds. Is that accurate?
Yeah, we mostly, really the only time we ever recommend like scarification or like scratching the seed is if you're growing more of like a really, specialty crop. Like if you're trying to grow a giant pumpkin kind of a thing, there's more specific instructions that people like to take, to make them germinate by a certain time and to help follow very specific timing instructions. But you can also stratify your seeds. That's pretty common, and that's mostly just putting them in a cold moist environment. So that'd be like wildflower seeds. If you want to start them just in your home garden, you could wrap some seeds in a moist paper towel, put them in the fridge for a few weeks, and that's pretty much the extent of that. But it's usually not necessary. You can usually grow seeds just fine without having to do that.
Excellent, but always follow the seed packet guidelines. Or check your websites. I'm sure you have all that information there. Okay, here's another question. How do I hold back from overplanting? I don't want to waste my seeds. And they're tiny. So what are your suggestions? Do you have certain tools that you recommend? How do you do that? I know the big commercial growers have their seed sowing machines, but we're talking to homeowners here. So how do we not overseed, either indoors or when we're planting outside,
If you're starting indoors, I know there's a couple little handheld tools. There's a reservoir that you put your seeds in, and then there's a opening that you can adjust the size of, and that can kind of help you meter yourself. For outdoor direct seeding, there are some what's called a jab planter, which is actually really nice because you can stay upright while you're seeding too, which is excellent. It's just there's a mechanism that opens up the soil. You just drop your seeds in when you're standing up there, and then there's a mechanism that closes it again. I think those are kind of rare, maybe, so good luck finding them, but they're great.
I think the best way to thin your seeds, because a lot of people overseeds, is to have your neighbor do it, because gardeners are notorious for not wanting to waste them, and man, they germinated, and you get attached to your little friends, and it's very hard, I think, for a lot of average homeowners to thin their own seeds. So I think it's best just to have a neighbor do it for you, give them a little training. But what you're doing, what scientifically the problem is you are introducing competition to an already very young plant trying to thrive. So when you are overseeding like that, you have several things competing for the same nutrients. So it is best. There are some plants that you can sprinkle more than, a few and not have a problem. Lettuce, lobelia, alyssum. But scatter them around the cell that you're using, or be very careful when you're outdoors, or thin them out. They're going to have to thin them out. A lot of people have that problem. That's why some genius invented seeding tape, because they just tape the seeds at the proper intervals and you plant the tape and you're done. It's a lot more expensive.
We have a couple blogs on seed tape, and that is exactly one of the key things. Is then you're not wasting seeds, you're not overseeding, and it's a lot easier. So yeah, seed tapes would definitely. I need those. That's what I need. Okay, I've heard you talk about watering, but I think we got some questions here, like, should you bottom water? Should you top water? Should you spray or mist? And at the beginning, should you moisten the soil or the growing medium before or after you sow the seeds? And then how do you not damage those teeny tiny little seedlings with watering, and they.
I think for me, when starting seeds, I like to pre-moisten my soil. It also just makes it nice when you're packing it in, so you're not overfilling your cells or anything. But then I like to just give it a little top off after I'm done planting them, and then typically I like to bottom water, just because I know I'm prone to overwatering if I do it from the top, and then you end up with soggy soil, and that's not always the best. So usually bottom watering is easy. You just want to remember to remove the excess water so that it doesn't just keep sitting in it.
Excellent. Any other watering tips?
I think misting can be a good option in certain circumstances, but generally I would caution against doing a misting, because you can it looks like you've watered them all nice and pretty, but then the soil underneath is really dry still. So get up and personal with that starting medium and put a finger in and see just how moist it really is.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's where all the root activity is happening, and that's why you need to keep the soil moist. Okay, that's good. Question about fungus gnats. Why are they so bad some years? Is it due to overwatering? Is it something in the growing medium? What would that be?
Well, fungus gnats are very commonly brought in from outdoors, so you do have to start with a sterile media. Even pallets of fresh potting mix could potentially have fungus gnat in it. So fungus gnats lay their eggs in the soil, and the soil has to be moist for them to do that. So fungus gnats tend to be a problem with overwaterers far more than people who like to keep things dry, because if you can keep the soil dry long enough to beat the life cycle of the fungus gnat, you've won. But it's initially a moisture problem, because they can't lay their eggs in the soil that's not sitting there wet enough for them to hatch. So moisture is a big part of controlling fungus gnats. Making sure you're using a sterile mix is very important to control fungus gnats. There are some tips and tricks, homeopathic tips and tricks for homeowners that we have tried to varying degrees of luck. But straight cinnamon powder can work as a top surface because it's a hot spice. So the fungus gnats will absolutely do not even want to lay their eggs in the soil. So there's a few tricks to avoid them. Once you have them, it's really a matter of disrupting the life cycle. So letting the plant dry out, and really watching your moisture control.
So my next question was going to be, what about the cinnamon myth? And so I think I heard you say it's not a myth.
Well, because we do indoor growing with Happy Leaf, we exclusively grow indoor, and we tried a lot of things and we were getting a lot of fungus gnats. And so we tried every myth. We didn't care. We just tried it. And we did notice a considerable decline using the cinnamon powder. What I think is more of a myth is putting the potatoes in the soil. Have you heard the one where you cut the potatoes and put them in there? The fungus gnats really like to insert their eggs in it, and then you just keep removing the potatoes every week. I've seen no luck with that. So there are some myths out there. But any of the hot oils or powders, I think, would work just fine.
Hey, Ashley, Jonalyn, any other comments on your experience with fungus gnats, or are you guys doing everything right and you never end up with fungus gnats?
I think I have a high tolerance for fungus gnats. I do want to put that out there too, that if you see any, it doesn't mean that you're unsuccessful and that you're a negligent plant parent. Some is okay.
Okay, that's good. Just because you see a couple doesn't really mean that you have to get rid of them. Yeah, okay. What about winter sowing? Okay, so we see all these milk jugs and winter sowing. So talk to us about that. What kind of crops is that best for? Or is there certain climates that are best for winter sowing?
That's a tough question, I think, because it's tough to winter sow.
It is, yeah.
I'm maybe going to step away from that question, honestly.
Anybody else have any success with it? I tried it one year, and I cannot say that it was very successful. Either way too many of them germinated or way too few germinated, and the ones that did got all leggy for me. I'm in Chicago. I don't know what happened. Maybe it was a weird winter, but anybody else? BJ or Ashley, have you ever tried it?
I have, but I use, end up using a lot of lights and heat mats and stuff to make it work the way I want it to work. It really depends too on where you're at, because winter sowing can look different if you're in Florida versus Chicago or Utah or Idaho, kind of a thing. Yeah, you just have to play around with it, I think, is the biggest thing. It's just trial and error, see what works for you.
Yes, yeah.
And I will say is the idea is that you'd be able to harvest maybe through the winter, that you're probably not going to be sowing in the winter, that if you want, say, spinach in the early spring, what you can do is seed them earlier, let them get a head start, and then overwinter those plants so that they are larger when it comes time to actually start growing again in the spring. And then you can get this great harvest in March.
So really, we're kind of talking about two different definitions of winter sowing then. Is okay, well, good. Glad we had that clarification. Let's talk a little bit about seed storage. I kind of feel like we're backtracking here, but maybe we should talk about that. But okay, so I'm sowing and I only use half a packet. How do I store that seed? Is there kind of a general guideline on the best place to store it? Do I want to put it over my oven in the kitchen? Do I want to put it in the deep freeze? Do I want to put it in the refrigerator? Where's the best place to store that seed?
Basically, you just want to create a nice, cool and dry and possibly dark environment. Basically, if you have a basement, you can keep them down there. You just want to make sure they're sealed up, so that if there's a leak or anything, they don't accidentally start germinating. I've had that problem before. But you can put them in like a freezer, but again, you want to make sure they're sealed up. You don't want to just put them in the fridge necessarily, because sometimes there's a humidity factor with that that can cause some problems. Basically, you can also look at, I like to use glass to help, store my seeds as well. Because if you're storing them somewhere kind of out of sight, out of mind, you know, something can get into them. If you have them in your garage, you never know, you know, is there going to be some animal that's going to start digging and find your seed collection and go snacking away? We've heard that story a couple of times.
Not too long ago, I was cleaning up my garage and found a little seed packet that I had forgotten about. And a mama mouse had crawled in there and had her babies and was nursing them when I went and grabbed the seed packet. So that, yeah, no. Don't recommend doing that as a surprise on a Saturday morning. Okay, so we talked about seed storage. Let's talk about hardening off. So you've started your seedlings, they're to a certain stage. Also want to know, should you transplant to like a larger, I think we need to talk a little bit about some size containers. So should you transplant before you take them out, and then talk about the hardening off process?
I'll talk about transplanting up to a larger pot. I think my rule of thumb is that if you can easily pull a seedling out just by its stem, then it's time to think about transplanting up. Now, if that means transplanting out to its forever home in the garden, great, do that. If it's still too cold, or maybe you're not prepared to do that, then you might want to consider moving up to a larger pot before moving them outside.
That's good. Okay, so what about hardening off?
Hardening off is extremely important. If you just take, you know, your brand new little seedling you've been nursing, you know, since you planted it, and you stick it outside, the change in humidity, you're going to have, you know, winds, changes in temperature, you know, going from day to night, all of those are going to wreak havoc on your little seedling because it hasn't been used to, you know, standing up to those different changes. So hardening off is basically when you set your plants out for, you know, a few hours at a time, building up over, you know, a week, maybe 2 weeks, however, you know, long you have until you can plant. It's just allowing them to build up kind of a harder skin, kind of like building how you would build up a callus on your hand to be able to, you know, keep doing a job over and over again. Your seeds build up, you know, these thicker cells to be able to handle those fluctuations that it would experience outside.
I like that analogy, like building up a callus. That's good.
I think here, I mean, people think of that as like sun exposure, but I'm so glad that Ashley said wind, because here I think that's our biggest, it's at least tied for number one, the biggest problem we have with acclimation. You know, Jonalyn mentioned it earlier too. If it's indoors and it doesn't have any air circulation, and it doesn't have those strong cell walls, you put it out in the wind and they could be toast over it very quickly here in the Midwest. I've seen more damage to seedlings than wind than I have sunburn or any other problems. But it's a very slow acclimation process to wind, sun, and different moisture levels and temperatures.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so then the last step here, I think, is transplanting them. So once you have them hardened off, any tips for transplanting?
Make sure you water them in well.
So I heard a grower say one time that you should always water them before transplanting. So never plant a dry root ball because it'll just have a really hard time recovering. So his suggestion was water them well and then transplant them. Now I've heard things, I mean, BJ, you mentioned this, you know, not on too windy of a day because you're going to transplant and, you know, there we go again. Should you pick a sunny day? Should you pick a little bit of a cloudier day? And obviously we're talking for the most part after the last frost date, but what about sunny versus overcast? Is one better than the other for transplanting?
I think as a general rule, it's always better to plant on an overcast day, because you don't have that sun variable from, you know, it's less of a shock. Anything you can do, that's why they call it transplant shock, because anything you can do to minimize the shock to this little baby infantile plant, the more success you're going to have. So I guess for transplanting, my biggest thing is I definitely plant them well watered, because especially if you're planting in relatively dry soil, it wicks water away from it. So if it's already dry, you're kind of at a deficit to begin with. But I think cloudy day, make sure you're planting a well-watered plant. And there are, if you're a product happy kind of person, there are transplant solutions that help minimize transplant shock. Mainly, some of them work by getting root hairs to develop quicker so that they can find their own moisture and get into the soil a little bit quicker. But getting them established is the hard part at all. So once they establish and have developed roots into the soil outdoors, you've made it. You should pat yourself on the back at that point.
That when you pour yourself a glass of wine and just enjoy it.
Yeah.
All your
Love
hard work has come to fruition. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't feel like I got to all the questions because there were a ton in here. Like I said, I think we have an email for you, BJ, for info@LED. Any other last things? One of the things I was going to ask you guys, what about a must-have? Now, this is an unfair question for you, BJ, because you're going to say the must-have for seed starting is an LED light. So I already planted that one. But are there any other must-haves for seed starting? I'll let each one of you name one other than LED lights, because we know that.
Well,
I can go. Oh,
okay, you go.
okay. Something that just kind of bugs me is I hate buying new trays over and over every year. So I like to use heavy duty trays that you can like wash and reuse. So that's just one of my must-haves, is so that I don't have to keep buying trays over and over.
Good point. Better for the environment too. You're not throwing them away. Excellent. Okay, Jonalyn.
I think mine is those, sometimes they're utility shelves, but it's shelves if you're using a window for light and maybe you don't have your LED lights. Sorry, BJ, I don't have any. Then you can put a lot of trays in that window if you're using height to your advantage.
Okay, and BJ. Okay. Oh, look, BJ has a whole setup there. Excellent.
I love that you just said that, because people like you and me who are madly in love with seeds, we need a lot of space, people, and you can grow a lot in a very small footprint in your house if you're using a baker's rack like this. So a shelving unit is awesome. Plus it gives you, so I would have to agree, that's one of my tools too, just for sheer volume, but it also gives you an inherent place to hang your lights. But I would say, and it's kind of, it's not a must have, but if you're going to do hot peppers and eggplants, I'd say a heating mat was definitely important for those particular crops, and a humidity dome. I think a humidity dome would solve a lot of people's problems and questions about moisture.
I agree. Yeah, that's awesome. Wow, look at this. You guys ended exactly at the top of the hour. Okay, so what I want to tell everybody, because I'm going to save the chat. There's so much in here. If you go down to the bottom of the chat box, hopefully you see the little 3 dots, and you can click on a button that'll save the chat for you. That way all the links are in there. All the questions that didn't get answered. BJ, you might be busy for a little while. You can answer some of those. And if anybody wants to send me some additional links that I send out, I'm talking to our panelists, I can send these out in a follow-up email after this webinar, because I'm going to follow up with everybody. So thank you. I got to leave right now. I got to go start some more seeds because I'm just super excited about it. This always happens on these webinars. That's all I want to do. I need to like renovate my entire house to be a seed house, I think. So anyway, thank you very, very much for your time, your ideas, your tips. It's wonderful. And I hope everybody has a great gardening weekend. Bye, everybody.